Good morning. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. And if y'all don't mind, as we have in the past, I'm going to open us up with a word of prayer, and then we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. Bow here with me. Heavenly Father, God, we thank you for this day, God. We thank you for all the blessings of life. We especially thank you as we have an opportunity to serve on behalf of this state, that we live in a nation and a state where you allow us to decide. The people have a voice and get to decide what's in the best interest of their community, their state, and nation. Thank you for those that protect that for us each and every day, that are all across the world serving on our behalf to keep us safe and protect that liberty that we enjoy. Thank you for those that have been a part of this committee on both sides, and whether you're a legislator or a stakeholder, just so thankful that people get involved and participate in the conversation of trying to do what's best. Thank you again for this time, and help us to make decisions, as always, in a way that will glorify you and best serve the people of this state. In Jesus' name I pray. Let's do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oh, well, thank you. And normally I haven't done this, but I made a few notes because, as you know, we're kind of wrapping up this study committee today, and I just wanted to say thank you again. Like I prayed, saying thank you to everyone who has participated in this committee. We couldn't do it without you. It wouldn't serve much of a purpose for us to sit up here and only be one side of this conversation, but we had so many people that were a part of this: the Georgia State Finance and Investment Commission, the Technical College System, the Regents, the Department of Education, the Association of General Contractors, and contractors from all across the state that drove up here to help us do this. And just wanted to say thank you, because what you do and what you have to share with us is vitally important to ensuring that we make the best decisions, or if we make any at all. And so thank you very much for that. I wanted to say thank you to our committee members. You'll hear me cry about it from time to time, and I'm not afraid that the sacrifices that so many of our colleagues make to do this. I was one of the ones that thought it was a part-time job. And boy, was I wrong, but that's okay. I'm committed to doing whatever, and I know these committee members are, to serve our constituents and serve this state. But I've introduced them before, but I just wanted to run back through them again, because in particular, like Mr. Craig Gordon, I think only had the opportunity to come to one meeting, and I'm not, he's not with us today, and I'm not criticizing that, but he's very, very busy and has a full schedule like everybody else, and didn't have the opportunity. But Mr. Emery Donahue down there on the end is with us, and he has been a big part of this committee. I know that Chuck Martin was not able to be with us today, traveling. Mr. Jimmy Pruitt, I think he's in California or something. Is that right?
It's a legislative meeting.
Yeah, legislative visit out there. And I was talking to someone earlier, in our chief of staff to the governor, Chris Riley, and some of them's in Africa. So, we're not just doing work here in Georgia, but everybody's busy. We originally on our committee had Chuck Williams, and he went to the Georgia Forestry Commission, and we got as fine a replacement in Mr. Buddy Harden as we could have. And he and I have had several phone conversations about this over the last several weeks, hours really probably of phone conversations. And I appreciate Mr. Buddy and his help. And Representative Werkheiser, I was down in his district about 2 weeks ago, and just really busy traveling, doing things with work and the family and that. So Mr. Jim James and Mr. down Schofield, the other members of the committee that don't necessarily have to do this, but want to help us, and I just appreciate them so much. So that's one of the things I really wanted to start off with, is just saying thank you to everybody who's helped us with this. I did want to restate kind of the purpose of all of this and what this committee has been challenged to do, because I just think it's very important that we remind ourselves every single time we meet what the the purpose is and why it's important. You know, I've tried to say this every time we've met, that one of the primary responsibilities, or really constitutionally, one of the only requirements we have, is to make sure that we set a balanced budget for this state. And I think it's only fair to say when you appropriate or you bond nearly $2 billion worth of work per year, that's a tremendous expense to the taxpayers, and one that we really wanted to look into how those projects were delivered on these delivery methods, to make sure we were doing that in a financially suitable manner, and making sure that we're taking all of that into consideration. You know, we were contacted for years now by contractors from all across the state that were concerned about being excluded or not allowed the opportunity to competitively bid for some of these jobs. And as they would meet with us more and try to express concerns to a lot of representatives and senators, and I felt like, and we felt like, that it was worth a thorough study in the off season to just kind of make sure if what they are saying is true or not, or if we can identify some areas where the perception was that they were not given an opportunity to compete for some of these taxpayer funded projects. I believe this committee's done a pretty good job of hearing from all the stakeholders in order to draft this final report, to be able to give to our leadership and to our colleagues for them to take a look at. And that's what we're doing today. We're this fifth and final meeting is to come up with a final report and draft and talk about some recommendations or suggestions. I believe we have identified some things that we might be able to make some suggestions on, but I also believe we've identified a number of things that was not a problem that perhaps many thought was an issue. And so we've seen both sides of that in trying to draft this final report and recommendations. All that's taken into consideration. You know, one of the things you'll particularly hear conservatives say is we just want to make an opportunity for everybody. An opportunity will create competition, and competition will keep that price low and keep everybody fighting for their equal share, regardless of what that is. And so we've got to do everything within our power to make sure that in this particular case, to make sure that all of the licensed, qualified, experienced, and insured general contractors have a fair opportunity to compete for these projects that we deliver in a couple of different ways. And one of the things that Mr. Woodward really did a great job of on behalf of GSFIC was explaining to us the difference in those delivery methods and why. You know, that was a whole nother challenge, trying to educate us on not just the different types of delivery methods, but why they're used and how they're used, and some of the ways that all of that happens. But quite frankly, I didn't realize that there was such a difference in the way that the Georgia State Finance and Investment Commission did it than maybe perhaps what our school systems do. So I didn't realize that, but that was one of the things that we did that I just wanted to sort of recap quickly. Was in our first meeting, it was just a very general overview of the different delivery methods, and that's where Mr. Woodward really helped clarify some things right out of the gate. At that second meeting, we dove a little bit deeper with all of our stakeholders, whether it was the regents, the technical college system, the school boards, the Department of Education folks, trying to help us dig much deeper into how those delivery methods start from start to finish, whether it was design, bid, build, whether it was construction management, or whether it was the construction management at risk type delivery methods. And so in the following two meetings, which is the third and fourth meetings, we heard from more of our general contractors that were not construction management firms, and we really just heard a lot of their concerns, or their perceptions rather. And I've been careful to try to make sure we say that some of this was the perception of what was happening because they had not had an opportunity to get involved in it enough to see all of the details of how it actually works versus perception. And after hearing from some of those general contractors, we heard from a number of construction management firms that had some tremendous success stories that started out design, bid, build, or hard bid, and they worked their way into the process of construction management, which was another tool for their firm to be able to use. They still do hard bid, design, bid, build, but they also try to go after some of the construction management type work. And so I'm going to kind of wrap up the recap part, but I wanted to remind everyone and really be clear on this, that as we draft this final report and Sarah emails it out to all of the members and we begin to read through it and then maybe compare that to some of the recommendations or suggestions you hear in this room this morning, these recommendations are only that. At the point we start looking at suggestions or recommendations to either our delegation to our colleagues in the House or over in the Senate, it all starts over. I mean, it literally starts over again, where those suggestions are either put in the form of changes or something, and we try to put it into legislation. Let's say it goes all the way back through the subcommittee hearings, a vote out of subcommittee to full committee, the full committee hearing, and then a full committee vote. So I just don't want anyone to think that because we discuss recommendations among this committee or with our other stakeholders, that's what they're trying to do. That they're trying to. I have had a couple of people call me and say that they were contacted, preempting any recommendations this committee has even made. We made no recommendations yet. We have had some very open and transparent conversations back and forth, but when someone runs out into the public and starts talking to other legislators about it, preempting what they think we might do, it causes more problems. Nobody has seen anything in writing as far as a report or recommendations. So what I would ask you to make sure you remember and consider is that any of the final report and recommendations are only that. That's it. And then we start having deeper, more thorough discussions on those recommendations to see if they're a good fit or even if they're feasible. Legislative counsel many times will tell you, no, Dominic, you can't do that. Okay, I'll go back to my office, I'm sorry, or whatever. So I guess Sarah had mentioned to me about this final report and emailing it out to the members and the recommendations, and that's a part that maybe can be a little bit confusing, that you don't walk out of here necessarily with a final report in your hand to run out there and start. We'll have to look at that and review it, make sure that final report kind of includes all of the things we've talked about and the recommendations. And so I'll have to sign that final report. The members will weigh in on their thoughts on this final report and make some additions or some changes if they deem necessary. So what I thought we would do by starting off is allow an opportunity for any of you that would like to, just briefly, if you wanted to weigh in this final meeting about some of your concerns, either that you have heard in other meetings or perhaps maybe some new thoughts that you've had in regards to looking into these delivery methods, or you might just want to, make some closing comments about a recommendation of your own. And so I won't pick on Mr. Woodward, but with Georgia State Finance and Investment Commission being such a huge part of this, not just a part of this committee, but a part of what we do every single day to deliver these projects, whether it be for Department of Natural Resources, the Technical College System, Regents, and whomever. Mr. Woodward, would you like to make any sort of some closing comments?
Good morning. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to have a great dialogue. I think we've had a lot of good discussion. I just want to say as a person that leads GISFIC that we're open to change. We understand that what we do isn't perfect. Our goal is to be better next year than we are this year. So if that means some changes, we're open, very open to that. Since our last meeting, I've had an opportunity to talk to some of our older employees, folks that have worked for us prior to the CM at risk process. And I said, tell me about your experiences when you first came to GISFIC. And one employee told me, he said, I had 4 projects. 2 of them were in default. 1 was in mediation, and the other one was going fairly well, but it was way behind schedule. Those were all under the hard bid delivery method. So what he told me is 2 of those projects had to be finished by the surety. And so there's a reason that the CM at risk delivery method was developed, not just here in Georgia, but nationally. And there's a reason it's used. I'm not telling you it's the sole method or the absolute best, but it is, I think it is the most appropriate for those projects that are more complicated and that where teamwork is needed. You are not reading in the paper project after project in Georgia being over budget or coming in late. And I think that's a credit to the contractors that we have, but I think it's also a credit to the CM at risk delivery method. So I guess my final conclusion is I would appreciate if we could continue to use all the tools in the toolbox. Hard bid, design bid build is certainly appropriate at times. Design build is appropriate at times. And CM at risk is appropriate at times. So I would just encourage the committee to allow all those methods to be used. And if some things need to be adjusted or tweaked in the CM at risk process, we're open to that and would welcome further dialogue. So that concludes my remarks.
All right, don't run off.
All right.
Any questions from the committee before he steps down? One of the things I hope we have tried to convey is that there was never I don't know that I've heard a conversation among these members that was looking in the direction of taking a tool out of the toolbox. I don't think so. Now, if someone has, then certainly. But again, that goes back to my earlier comment of people out in the public preempting the final recommendations of this committee and actually telling other members, leaders in these caucuses, senators, that we're going to try to do something that this committee has not.
Right.
Now, we've asked some tough questions. I know I have. And so I really don't, I hope that no one has heard us say that we are looking at taking that tool out of the toolbox. Craig, is that you, number 26? Who's number 26? Okay, I'm sorry. Representative Donahue.
Let me ask, a couple of meetings back, I asked a question. With everything present that we're doing now, if your Christmas wish list, what 2 things would you pick different you think could better the process? And you can pick 3, but just 2 things. You make a living doing this. There's something that basically that we could do better. Just 1 or 2 little things.
I think the number one thing, there are some firms that are not getting the CM work. So I think holding workshops and trying to educate them on how to work the process, how to submit better proposals, how to interview, maybe more in a way that would put their firm first. So I think anything we can do to educate those firms that maybe aren't as familiar with CM at risk would be high on my list. After that, I'm not sure I have another suggestion at this point.
Well, thank you.
Any more questions? This might be your last shot, and he's been the go-to guy so far when it comes to the knowledge of this construction management or the design, bid, build, delivery methods. All right, Mr. Buddy, Representative Harden.
Yeah, I was just wondering, and I think all of the methods that have been outlined here are good methods. And I assume you gave a little example there of where some projects were and they had to be finished by surety, but do you have any idea what percentage of projects were in that group? I mean, was that an outlier, or was half of our projects not being done correctly under the old design, bid, build?
That was probably 15 years ago, so it was prior to my joining GISFIC. So I mean, I can't give you a percentage, but it was probably, my perception was it was probably close to 50% of projects were really struggling, coming in late, not being finished.
That was 15 years ago. What do you think now? Are you seeing, are we still doing design, bid, build, and are a lot of them still, 50% of them still ineffective?
It's less than that, but the percentage of projects that don't go well are higher in that category than they are in the other two categories that we use.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Buddy's question and your answer just kind of sparks a thought about how do you decide currently on which delivery method you use? Why is it that we still, we obviously still do quite a few hard bid, which is design, bid, build. What's the guideline or the determiner of using design, bid, build versus a construction management?
Great question. It's not a hard and defined checklist. If the project is fairly well designed, and it's far along in the process, and that could be just because of the funding cycle. And so, the architect's mostly complete with the plans, we're comfortable with those, we'll just go ahead and hard bid it at that point. If we think it's a fairly routine building where we don't need a lot of input from the CM, and we feel like the design team can handle that, then that would be another area or another situation where we say, let's go ahead and hard bid it. If the budget is just really extremely tight, we may choose to hard bid it just to see if we can get the project in on budget. So those would be the main factors for hard bid. If it's a more complicated project and one where the time frame is extremely tight, we believe the CM at risk delivery method assists us in that through that teamwork and the ability to get the best folks working on the project and the ability to get the best subcontractors so that we have assurance that project will come in when the agency or campus needs it.
Were you, and this is going to be more specific, I just kind of had this thought again while you were talking, were you at GISFIC when South Georgia State College did the swimming pool facility?
I was not.
Okay. And again, kind of coming out of a background of light commercial and residential construction with the company that I own and work for. In all of the projects that I've done homework on over the last 6 to 8 months, I came up with a list of about 90 in South Georgia. That swimming pool facility at South Georgia State College was the only one I could find where the builder went broke and just had to more or less walk away from it. So that's not 100, but it was 80 to 90. And it was of hard bid projects. And your number was around 50% that that had problems over schedule.
Yeah,
And
I'm
what
not
I was
saying-
referring to.
I'm not saying they went out of
right,
business, but they were severely delayed,
Right.
just
And-
not able to perform.
And one of the questions that this committee asked was, do you ever have a time when a CM project goes over? And the answer was yes.
Yep.
Do you ever have a time when it comes in over budget? And the answer was yes.
The answer is no.
I've used
'Cause-
an example in this committee 15 different times on Bacon County schools.
Well, not a JustFIC
No,
project.
I was saying in general on the
Right.
questions to this
'Cause-
committee. I
right.
wasn't saying that Mr. Woodward said
Right.
yes. I'm just saying of the presenters that we've had, there's been a number of questions that said, did they ever come in over budget? And there was several answers of yes. Did they ever come in over the timeline? And so, for the sake of making sure that we're having the full conversation, those are fair things for this committee to consider when a CM, a construction management delivery method, and a design bid build delivery method, both of them run into all sorts of unexpected, particularly in renovations where they don't even know what's under the floor when they tear it up. It may be no floor at all, or it may be something that requires some additional attention, asbestos or whatever it might be. And so, but I want to say again, while you're there, I really appreciate, and I've said this, you've listened to me and tried to rein me in and corrected me when I needed to be corrected, and I really appreciate your willingness to work with us and be honest about how you use the construction management delivery method, because I can say, just in my own personal opinion, y'all do a much more thorough job working through all of the steps of that construction management delivery method than do some that are out there using it.
I appreciate that. I just wanted to comment that if the CM process is administered properly, it shouldn't come in over budget. The whole idea is to work towards the budget that the team has been given. And so if a project is over budget, then the owner has made that decision to spend more money. But the team's charge is to build the best project they can for the amount of money that they're given. And I think that's the beauty of that delivery method.
Thank you so much.
All
I
right, thank
appreciate
you.
it. Well, and again, not to pick on people, but I know that Mark has been very helpful to us to me, answering a lot of questions. And I would love to give our Association of General Contractors an opportunity to make just some closing comments and maybe answer a few questions if the committee has any. I know that I've said this all along, that you have a very unique perspective on all of this because you represent such a diverse group of contractors, whether it's specialty contractors, general contractors, construction management firms, etc. So it's yours, buddy. Appreciate you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, appreciate the opportunity. I would start out by echoing everything Mr. Woodward just said. I have a document that I'd love to pass out to the committee that goes back a number of years to 2002. There's a publication that's probably the most well-recognized publication in the commercial construction industry, Engineering News Record. Marvin's predecessor felt so strongly about how lacking we were in quality at the state level through his department that he wrote a pretty scathing editorial in this national magazine. What has changed since 2002 to where we are today? Not only having additional tools in the toolbox that we've talked about a lot, but there's a partnership now between our public owners, JustFIC. I've had the pleasure personally of serving on an advisory committee with JustFIC, with the Board of Regents and others. And so we learn from each other. We meet quarterly or so, and we're asked to develop our side of the agenda. And they do the same with their side of the agenda to jointly and collectively address issues that improve the industry. So again, I would echo what Marvin had indicated he had heard from one of the old timers, but let me pass this out to you real quick. I had to dig through the internet forever to find this thing, but it'll tell you a little bit about what some of our state agencies felt about the process. Representative Donahue, I'll try and answer the question you asked Mr. Woodward. First of all, I want to tell you, Mr. Chairman and committee, that your efforts and this committee's efforts have given the industry an opportunity. Sometimes we don't hear about stuff in Atlanta and what's going out in all of our counties with regard to construction or otherwise. Having this topic move through a legislative process and this committee get formed, we've had the benefit of hearing some things that we hadn't been hearing. And I'm here to tell you that we believe as an industry that there are a number of things that can be done to improve the process. One of the biggest things that you've heard quite a bit about is access, opportunity to participate in a delivery system that we're aware of solicitations out there that basically say the only way you can get in the game is if you've already been in the game. So if you haven't, how do you get there? So we have some recommendations I'd be happy to share with the committee. I would say you have two excellent examples right here with Regents and GISFIC about their collaboration with the industry. We would ask to be able to do that with DOE and GMA and ACCG, and developing documents that beyond law that collectively represent best practices on when to look at doing something design, bid, build, when to look at something potentially CM at risk or design, build, and best practices of how you go about selecting the provider of those services, appropriate criteria, weights, so forth and so on. Because a lot of times, a lot of things that we've heard about the problems is folks simply don't know how to do it. And giving them a blueprint that's not one-sided, that's collective both from industry and government to do so would be a tremendous help, particularly at the local level.
All right, well, do y'all have any questions for,
So basically, access, education, the same process you would say would be what we would need, better access and to educate a little bit better.
Absolutely.
That way, that person that does a $3 million job, and now he's wanting or she's wanting to graduate up to a $20 million job, maybe they need to go to a $10 million job, but they don't know where the $10 million job is to bid on, or the 5 or 6. And if we make it a little more broader, then people have that access, then they can be educated. That should improve the system.
Absolutely.
any other questions? Representative Donahue mentioned an example that we talked about several times in this committee of a general contractor trying to work their way into the CM process. And many times the request for qualification draws them out before they ever get into the, not even going to come close to making a short list, because the request for qualification specifically says, have you done $5 million projects, or have you done, and again, these are different. It can be different from Georgia State Finance Investment than it is from our school systems. I get it. But when you have a general contractor, and you and I have talked about this, and this is one of the areas where we all agree. I think we've talked about agreeing, but a general contractor that's built numerous $5 million projects under the design, bid, build method should not be written out of the opportunity to get into the construction management at risk delivery method, because they've never actually done a $5 million job under CM. They are licensed exactly the same. A general contractor's license is exactly the same as a construction management firm's license. The only difference is on the RFQ, it specifically says, have you, what is your CM experience? Well, if that is 1 to 15, the people scoring it will say, well, he only gets a 6 or whatever because he's never done a CM job, and the construction management firms that are at the pre-bid or responding to the RFQ all get much higher scores. And so I guess where the question is in that is, would that be a fair thing for us to look at, that you should not be disqualified in the RFQ because you have a lot of experience, you just don't necessarily have it in construction management?
We as an organization, and this was part of the prayer meetings we had within our membership between the very large and the medium-sized and small firms, is that you ought not automatically be disqualified from consideration simply because you've never delivered a project as a CM, provided that you have adequate capacity, so forth and so on. At some point in time, all the folks in Georgia that are CMs, they had never done one either until they get in the game. So you have to allow, particularly in the public arena, opportunities for access to these public markets. And we would absolutely agree with that. And a number of years ago, the General Assembly did do something legislative that was comparable. It used to basically said you had to have done X number of these projects as a CM of this size or greater. And what the General Assembly did is they, instead of saying 100% of that threshold, they knocked it down to 70%. So in other words, there was a $10 million project at question, and you'd only done a $7 million CM project, but you had adequate capacity for the project in question. You no longer could be automatically disqualified, because I'd never done one at 10 million. I'd only done one at 7 million. But I successfully completed it, and I got capacity for the one in question, so therefore I ought not be disqualified. And that same concept could be employed here, that you ought not be disqualified simply for the fact that you never have done one before. I, as a company who've never done one, I could hire someone from another firm that's done 50 of them, and now he's on my team, okay? And that happens in our industry all the time, but that company's never done it as Mark Woodall Construction, you know? Mm-hmm. But now if I get Jim James on board that's done 100 of these projects somewhere else, then yeah, I ought to be able to utilize part of his experience and capacity in his prior work because he's now on board with my firm. So there's 100 different ways to get around it, but at the bottom line, we firmly believe as AGC in the public arena, that process needs to be open, competitive, and allow qualified firms access to markets.
Right. And you mentioned sufficient capacity, and some of that is determined with your bonding capability and the experience of jobs that you've done and those things, right? That you're just a company that's, I hate to say large enough, but a company that can handle that size and scope of work, and that has proven that in some form or fashion with your work history.
And I think Representative Donahue's example of appropriately growing versus going from 0 to 100, that's a recipe for disaster.
Right, and I think what I've tried to bring into this conversation is the challenges, and we have a House Rural Development Council right now traveling all around this state to identify some areas where general contractors have a legitimate concern about the number of opportunities they've even had to do a CM. Not only is it fairly new in these more rural parts of the state, because school systems or GISFIC or whoever was delivering the project chose to do it design, bid, build. Now that it is kind of a growing opportunity for them, if you lived in Augusta, Athens, Columbus, Macon, Middle Georgia, I could just name all the areas, Atlanta, well, you had numerous opportunities based purely on your geography to do exactly what Representative Donahue said. Well, I can't go after that $7 million one, but there's 5 $3 million ones that I can go after. If you're from Douglas, Georgia, there wasn't one construction management project, and I'm talking about in the last 10 to 15 years. I don't mean today. In the last 10 to 15 years, you might see one of those construction management opportunities float by just every once in a while. And you know what would happen? all of them construction management firms from around the state would come swooping in there because they met the qualifications of, have you ever delivered a construction? Well, none of them guys in those small communities had. Well, then not only would they come in and not only would the construction management firms from those higher populated areas of the state come in, but they would come in and then maybe try to, I don't know if the right word's joint venture, or try to get a local general contractor to maybe partner with them, which is fine. I'm not criticizing that. But it was almost like being a subcontractor, not necessarily joint venturing, in that they could use that as experience on the next opportunity, because that next opportunity may be few and far between. So I've tried to bring this up in our Rural Development Council, not all the discussion about the delivery methods, but how there were a lot more opportunities for construction management because of the way schools are funded. It had to be based on need, and the populations of our community are going down. So not only are they not qualifying to build a lot of new schools, whether it's under design, bid, build, or construction management, even with GISFIC, they don't do near as many projects in rural and South Georgia, rural Georgia, as they do in these higher populated areas where there's a lot more opportunity. So I know I'm kind of rambling, but do you see sort of where I'm going with how it was stacked against more of these medium to small general contractors purely based on geography, because there just were not opportunities? If there had been as much opportunity in those areas as there were in Atlanta, they would have done exactly what Representative Donahue said. They would never, if the biggest building they'd ever built was $4 million, they would never reach out there and try to get a $20 million one. I don't think. Maybe they do, but it just seems unlikely.
Well, two industry recognized best practices. Number one, right sizing the contractor for the project, and number two is local participation, to the extent that local participation capacity exists. So we would encourage that. Representative Donahue, I'm going to come back to your question again. Very early on, we heard testimony about sometimes how difficult it is to find out about the opportunities that are all over the place. At the state level, we advertise our procurement opportunities on the procurement registry, DOAS. At the local government level, the law allows them to either advertise in the legal organ of the county or an internet site. But, internet sites can go up and go down. One of the things that came out in some of the testimony we think was an excellent idea is requiring the local government opportunities to also be on the Georgia Procurement Registry. They're already doing some of that now, but that would allow somebody to go to a single source versus trying to track down all the legal organs or track down websites and then find out about those contract opportunities. So something that's maybe potentially worth looking into.
Well, I could certainly see where if there's state funding in it, it would be easier to you have to be careful throwing around the word require up here, because it turns into the word mandate and then it turns into something else. But if there's state funding in it, I think that would be appropriate. But if it's local SPLOST revenue and or their general revenue that we may not necessarily have an investment in it, it would be hard to mandate that they publicize that anywhere else. But you're exactly right.
If it doesn't cost anything, they're getting additional.
Hey, I'm with you. But again, that word require and just gets kind of crazy. But I think you're exactly right. To make sure that there's sufficient publications that let contractors know what's available in those areas. Any other questions for Mr. Woodall? Or all right.
We appreciate the
Thank you
opportunity, and again, if we can jointly work with the committee, our public owners, private owners, everybody, our designers, we want to be part of that process and jointly develop best practices on this topic and anything, quite frankly, related to the construction industry.
All right. And again, I'm just kind of calling people out, but Mr. Mike Rowland, I know with our Department of Education, you shared with us at one point or a few times in our committees, and I'll kind of stimulate you a little bit with not a question, but just maybe some thoughts as you're preparing to give us some closing comments. it was very troubling to me how differently the school systems utilize that delivery method than say than GISFIC. Almost to the point of not even close to the same, where they would draft these RFQs that were almost tailored to a very few firms that could qualify. So again, I don't necessarily have a question in there, but how differently those delivery methods are. So you offer up your closing comments.
Well, I think that the previous speakers have eloquently stated, my own thoughts in terms of CM at risk as a method of delivery that is available, that has a place. Let me kind of go back to, let me see if I can frame what you're talking about in this way. Maybe this is an explanation for the difference, or at least provide some context for the difference between state agencies and local jurisdictions, particularly school systems. And as in the Department of Education, we also manage the capital projects for the 3 state schools, the school in Macon, Cave Spring, and the one over in Clarkston. And GSFIC manages those projects for us, and we hard bid every one of them. So and I wanted to, I don't have a lot of the expertise these guys do. I'd like to think I got a little bit of common sense. What I see is that GISFIC operates as kind of a central holding authority for state projects, so that all the procurement runs through this process, whether it's good or bad, whether it could be tweaked, or whether it works the same way every time. Think about all that water runs through the same funnel, which eventually goes in the same stream. On the school side, you have 180 school systems, all constitutional jurisdictions in this state that operate independently of one another. And so when it comes to construction projects in any number of these school systems, they operate on their own. How is the RFP constructed? It's constructed within the framework of that local jurisdiction. Most of the time using an attorney to guide their way, but not necessarily always. And so it doesn't take 4 years of high school to figure out that creates wide variation. And so so I think one of the explanations for that has to do with the fact that that within school systems, each operating independently, there's really no funnel to send all of that kind of thinking through. And so you get this wide variation in the way the process is administered, the way an RFP is constructed, the way a team is selected to review the qualifications of the RFP. And I don't have any answer to that. I think you all know, because of the way representative government works, that both the positive and the negative, the way we operate is our local school systems have control over those functions. So I'm not necessarily trying to answer that question, but or I know it wasn't really a question, but maybe just provide some context to what I see as a contributing factor to that situation. I do want to point out, though, and I think Mr. Woodward mentioned this, and it was also related to in the other comments. If it's done correctly, and it doesn't matter, one thing that we haven't talked much about is, you can do design, bid, build with a qualifications-based proposal. It doesn't have to be a hard bid. I can select a general contractor where price is a component of the selection process, but it's not the component, because you guys have testified in your own experience that the cheapest guy is not always the best job. And so there's a way to implement design bid build where you have some control over how you select the contractor. Price is important. Maybe the low guy gets all the points that are added, available for that category, but you also get to look at his experience and other things.
Right, not to interrupt you, I apologize, but I believe Dooley County Schools, I think I'm right. I've looked at so many I can't remember, but I think they're doing a pre-qualification, shortlist, hard bid. That's kind of what you're referring to right there, right? I mean, that's
Well, yeah, I wouldn't
where
call
price
it,
is is
Right,
part of that component,
right.
but it is not the.
right, and I wouldn't call it. Let me, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to sound like the voice of authority on pre-qualifying, but my lawyer friends have taught me that pre-qualification of bidders is not. They tell me it's a bad thing, and here's why. They say, look, why would you set up a situation, if you're going to pre-qualify a bidder, then there must be some contemplation that somebody won't qualify. So if we're going to qualify a list of 5 bidders, why would we tell one bidder you're not qualified? Because now that bidder has to go out in the market and justify why he is, or we have to prove that he isn't, because he's got to work in that market. And if we disqualified him, he's got to be disqualified for other similar bid opportunities. So what we do is let him compete. Don't disqualify him. If he can't compete, he'll be number 2 or 3 or 5. That disqualifies him from being number 1. And the process takes care of itself. So I think what happens in this situation is it's not necessarily a pre-qualification of components. It is compete. Here are the 5 I'm making numbers up now. Here are the 5 categories. Anybody can apply. Anybody can, and I go back to I think what you said about crafting RFPs where they are narrowly restrictive. That's not a good practice. Like Mark's, that's not a best practice. A best practice is to write an RFP that lets everybody compete. And then in the competition, there's a one, and there's a first and a last. And first wins, and last doesn't mean bad. It just means you don't win. You compete another day for another project. So, I think what I see in school systems particularly is that that's where, and you mentioned this, Mr. Chairman, in your comments, that perhaps one of the things that would be beneficial is to have some more standard guidance about what an RFP should look like. Maybe not using language that says thou shalt not do this, but I like the idea of best practice documents, and there's several out there even in our environment that law firms have written, and construction lawyers particularly, that say this is the best way to do it. And I think we have to continue to try to educate local school systems to go down that path.
Well, I like Representative Donahue's question as far as, and I know you've been a part of most of these meetings. Are there some things specifically? I know you just mentioned one about the possibility of looking at a consistent, reasonable template of some sort for an RFQ. And again, I don't even know if I said that right, but
I think you did.
for some guidance, because I think I know one of the things I've seen, and I get confused about what the entire committee has seen and what I have had conversations with people about personally, but I have seen and have in my possession RFQs. I could have told you. I could have told you who's going to build the school. I mean, I could have told you who the design professional is going to be and the contractor. And so we've been very careful not to name names, and I will not. But that's not fair to any of these guys. That's not fair to the other CMs. That's not fair to the general contractors, the specialty contractors, because when that guy, I keep saying guy, it could be men or women, right? They also bring with them their own friends that are subs, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, we we certainly agree. The position of the department, I think, that I communicate is that we agree with that. And I think if you can look at an RFP and being just a average guy like you and I, and we can come to that conclusion, that is not, even if we were to stop short of saying it's illegal, we certainly know it's not appropriate. I think we could certainly all agree to that.
Right.
So we are certainly on the same page with you there. I you know, part of the problem, well, I hate to use the word problem. Here's an issue. DOE has a rule. You know, we govern by guidelines and rules. We take the law. The law says, you guys go make up some rules about how it should work, and we do. Well, one of our rules says that if you use any other construction delivery method for a school project, regardless of funding source, doesn't matter whether it's state funds or local funds, and it is any delivery method other than design, bid, build, then prior to the issuance of the RFP, you have to provide DOE with a letter from your legal counsel saying that they've reviewed the information that the district provided and certify to its legality, that it meets the requirements of statute. Now, so that sounds pretty good. You'd say, well,
Say that again carefully,
all right.
or not
The
carefully.
actual rule, I think Pat
slowly.
may have brought some copies of it. It's 160-5-4-.15.
Yeah.
The only thing I can commit to memory other than my phone number. There's a section in there that says if you use any construction delivery method other than design, bid, build, that would be design, build, CM at risk, CM agent. If you use any of those delivery methods, the school system is required to submit to or to provide. Let me say, I want to go back and choose these words carefully. The school system is required to document that prior to the issuance of the RFP, their attorney reviewed the documents and certifies in a letter that based on that review, it meets the requirements of statute and state board rule. Because the state board rule says somewhere in this same paragraph, it doesn't matter where the money comes from. If it's a K-12 project, you can't do anything to restrict competition. So, I guess what I want to point out is, I think we have some rules or policies in place that are intended to get at the very thing that you're talking about. As with anything else, the fly is in the enforcement, and so we try to think of that as a compliance issue. If the school system complies with that, then we ought to be able to say with certainty they knew it was lawful, and if not, the lawyer should have caught it. So perhaps going back to the wish list, maybe one of the things that we can do internally is begin to think about how we re-educate school systems on this particular portion of the state rule, and then create a process where if you don't do that, it's in spite of the process and not because of it, if that makes any sense.
It does. Any other questions? I know that one time you had mentioned someone, I can't remember who, brought up the issue about convenience contracts. And again, I'm just a mess when it comes to remembering all the specifics, but that raised some concerns, I think, and then maybe someone else that was sitting in the room repeated it after you, that they thought 5-year convenience contracts were just flat out illegal.
Yep.
And so I'm not putting you on the spot, or I guess I am. This will be a question. Can you kind of help us to understand that a little bit better? What is a 5-year convenience, or
Yeah,
may not be 5-year? I don't know what it is, a convenience contract.
I appreciate the opportunity to clarify those remarks. There is no such thing as a convenience contract in the construction world. You know that, and I do too. But when you think about, in using that phrase, perhaps what I was attempting to do was create some nomenclature that that captures what's really going on instead of what should be going on. And here's what I've seen happen a few times, and I've seen it happen in South Georgia, Middle Georgia, North Georgia, East Georgia, and West Georgia, where the local Board of Education will issue an RFP that says, we are looking for construction manager at-risk services to help us replace a roof at our elementary school and build a new middle school. It's a hypothetical project. We've got 2 projects in our queue. They're ready to go. We want to use CM at risk as our delivery method for both of those projects. We want to hire one firm to do it. So far, so good. Everybody understands on competition day, that's what you're competing for. Then there'll be a clause in that RFP, a little line at the bottom that says, and any other project that the board deems necessary and fit at some point in the future. And to go along with that, and this contract shall be for a time period, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. All right, when you create this time period and this language that contemplates their future unknown projects, and this is where this convenience idea comes from for me. So there's no basis for that other than my own way of communicating it. So if I'm a school system, which is where my experience is, and my core mission is teaching, not building, and I hire a guy, go through a process and vet him for these 2 projects which I've identified, and 6 months down the road, I get another roof I've got to replace or an HVAC system. Man, you know, it kills us to go through that process. I just like to turn to the guy that I've already selected and say, here, go do it. That's very convenient. But my point has been, it is my opinion, humble as it may be, that is not the intent of the statute. The intent of the statute, and maybe the language of the statute says, if there's a new bid opportunity, a new proposal opportunity, new to the original document, you really have to go back to the market. And so that's what I've tried to communicate, that when school systems have let themselves get into these multi-year contracts where they've identified potential future projects, that's not an appropriate interpretation of how the statute intended the system to operate, in my opinion.
Representative Werkheiser.
Okay, so you're saying that that language, it's legal, but that's just not the intended use. It's legal to put that vague requirement at the bottom and a time period?
I don't think so. I mean, and again, I refer to legal counsel, but there are 2 things at play. One is I don't pretend to interpret the statute from the law point of view, other than I can read it. What it seems to say to me is that every time you have when it comes to public dollars, every time you have a project, the public ought to have a chance to propose on it. And you can define the number of projects. It can be one.
But are they using that, quote, loophole because there's extra money? I mean, wouldn't that be a way to close the loophole to say anytime there's new money being let?
Yeah, excellent. Let me rephrase your question from my point of view and see if this is what we're both talking about. Perhaps one thing that could help, and again, I've gotten this from some of my lawyer friends who would say, hey, if there's something that could be done, perhaps the law could define new bid opportunity.
Right.
Because what happens is the district, not to put, but that's sort of if I don't know the definition and the law doesn't say what it is, then I get to create my own. And so new bid opportunity isn't something new that happened. It's because I've got this 5-year window that I said, you're my guy or gal. And so it'll be outside that bid opportunity, outside that time period, and that would be new. When in reality, what those of us who do this work for a living says is that no. If it wasn't listed in that first,
Right.
and it's another one, that's new. And so if the law said, when this happens, that's defined. You guys know the law defines things all the time. So if we just defined new bid opportunity, what does that look like? And that would tell a school system when you have to go back to the market.
Right. It makes me.
Does that
So
really-
to change that loophole, how would it be changed? Legislatively?
well, I think
Or is it in?
Is that a rule
No,
in
I
what you
think-
do
I
at DOE, or is that is that a piece of code section?
I think in the code section that the code section that says how to bid public works projects, there should be a definition for it. You guys check me on this now.
So that would be a good thing to put on our, list.
I think so.
okay.
Somewhere in that language of the statute, it refers to new bid opportunity. And it would be good if there was a definition of that. That's correct.
And that makes me think of, and we don't want to get started about all the things I think about, but it makes me think about SPLOST, because on the referendum that the taxpayers levy themselves a tax. And some of these projects are SPLOST funded. How in the world could you enter into an open-ended timeline? And again, you see where I'm going. I know that when you vote on a SPLOST, it says it's this education building, it's this recreation building, or it's this city hall.
That's right.
Well, if through that little process, the RFQ basically had some language down there that said, and future projects will be added if funds are available. Well, you can't do that. It's not one of the three, so it just
Yeah.
got my mind running
No.
away. We got another question right here, Mr. James.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to note that there is a delivery method called job order contracting, and it's not really for convenience. It's really to expedite very small projects, adding a door, paint, small mechanical work. When it's used properly, it does save money because you already pre-bid components of construction or electrical work, what have you. So that's a legitimate delivery method, but it's not intended to do what you're talking about,
That's
a
right.
major building addition. So I would tend to agree with you that those should always be publicly let.
And DOAS has an arm that does the contracting that
Yeah.
you described.
So if the committee addressed that issue, I think we want to make sure we didn't necessarily, without intent, disqualify job order contracting, because it is a useful tool.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I had spoken with one of our college presidents about that, that the guys that are out there working to do these construction management delivery methods or the design bid builds, they're not signing up to go replace doorknobs
That's right.
at
That's right.
at Valdosta State University or fix door jambs and different handrails that they have to repair. That's what you were talking about, the work order type. And that is a very accountable process because they have to approve it. Even though you've signed up with them, they still have to say, hey, I need a PO for this, and this, or whatever.
Well, you mentioned SPLOST, and not to belabor this point, but see if I can. Here's another thing that I think we see a little bit of, and so it is true that the SPLOST dollars are defined by the referendum, where they go. And so a local school system will have a 5-year SPLOST plan. Okay, here's all the things we said we would do with all of our SPLOST money. We're ready to do the first 2, but the next 5 are in the future. And we said the money was going to be used in this 5-year cycle to do that. You'll see where I'm going with this. So would it make sense if I were to hire a CM at risk for the 2 things I already know, because we got those spooled up, they're shovel ready, we're ready to go. But these 5 other things that are on my list, I'm not ready to do them yet. Could be a lot of reasons. One, I can only do so much construction at one time, and then the other is I got to collect the SPLOST dollars before I can do it, assuming we didn't bond any of that. And so what you could see is the school system would say, well, what I really want is to select one firm that I would use for my SPLOST program. So everything in my SPLOST program is defined. It's just that there's only 2 that I'm ready to get prices on and get started on, the rest come in the future. Again, I want to emphasize, if you were asking me as a DOE employee, is that the right way to go? I'd say no. Because even those future opportunities that are listed in a SPLOST are new bid opportunities if they're not ready to go. If you're not ready to get started, they represent new bid opportunities. So,
Well,
good question.
sounds like Representative Werkheiser is gonna get busy trying to define new bid opportunities.
Well, and I do appreciate that question. I have mentioned that there's an Atlanta construction law attorney that I counsel with from time to time more than anything else. If I'm thinking something, I usually call him and say, okay, I'm thinking this, tell me what's right or wrong about it. And he has said to me several times, I really think if you could define that in the statute, that would be helpful.
That's right. Thank you so much. And
Thanks, guys.
I go back to the comment I made. That's not fair even to the other construction management firms for someone to abuse and try to float out those new bid opportunities when they would love to come back to the table. Even though they didn't get those first two, they'd love to come back and lay out their, desire to have those new bid opportunities. I want to make sure I'm not over. Is anybody here with the technical college system? Mr. James, do you have any? And I'm going to kind of transition from out here. I see one of our senators in the group this morning, Senator Dugan. Would you like to make a comment or anything before we come to the front table with the committee members? Would you like to make a few comments? Would love to have you. I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Dugan. I am in the Senate, but I'm also a contractor in my day job. It depends on who you talk to. We're either one of the big guys or one of the little guys. It depends on, we're right there in the middle. We do design, bid, build, CM at risk, CM agent, and it just depends on where we are and what the owner wants to, how they want to perform. There's a couple of things that I would like to say. When you're doing CM at risk and you're selected, there's a misconception that the subs have to be selected completely by the GC. They don't. Within CM, the owner can stipulate that I want all the competing sub bids, because at that point it does kind of become a hard bid for different subs wanting to do the work. I want them open in front of me. And I want to have say within the budget of who I'm going to use. Now, everybody does it differently. We try as a company to get subs that are local to the area for a variety of reasons. One, it's good for the area, but two, if something happens after the construction is done, it's too easy for us to call up on the phone and say, hey, I need you to run over to building X and look at this. I know not everybody does that, but it's also more cost effective for us because they're not picking up and staying someplace else in the state. They're going home every night. They're eating at their house. So I know that others don't do that, but most do. And the local participation can also be part of the scoring weight on selection of the GC. And I know we call it CM at risk. I would rather it be called CMGC because it's basically a two-part deal. But I'm going to go with the terminology that exists right now. Representative Donahue, your Christmas question has sparked a lot of interest today, so I'm going to go ahead and go down that road too, if I could. My first thing on the Christmas list would be do away with the pre-CM requirement. As we talked about before, when CM at risk became a tool in Georgia, obviously nobody would have qualified for it. So they need to have the capability. And they need to be able to display the capability because it is a two-part deal. There is a difference. But if a company can have that, like y'all have a wonderful company down in your part of the state that has the capacity to do CM. They haven't done a lot of CM because there hadn't been a whole lot of CM requirements down there. But that would be an example of a company that could walk in on a CM right now that has the capacity to do it. Some of the other ones may need to partner with somebody and one company help them with the CM piece, and then they do the GC piece. But that's an agreement they would have to work out between the companies. The second thing I would do would be right-size projects. If you've got a $1 billion a year company doing a $2 million municipal pool, that's not right. And I think everybody understands that. Transparency. We're going to hear that over and over and over again, from the beginning of the process to the end of the project. I have also seen those contracts where you look at it and go, well, this is so-and-so. Everybody knows that's not right. But we need to be a little bit more transparent on the front side to eliminate any chance of manipulating the system. And one of the ways I would do it, and these guys here were probably going to scream at me for saying, I would use the state construction manual across the state with any public dollars. Because you have Lawyer A in Southwest Georgia that does one public school that's typically going to be a CM type thing every 20 years. And now he's drawing up the contracts that are going to go before the school board, that are going to pick the architects and the GC. They don't know what they're doing.
The state construction manuals utilized mostly by the GISFIC. Is that what you're saying? That like your school systems and all, they don't go by the guidelines in that state construction manual so
No,
much?
we're a big believer in local control until we don't believe in it.
That's right.
So I guess what I'm saying is
Right.
that we have a proven tool that already exists within the state. And instead of putting smaller communities that don't do as many of these at a disadvantage, take the tool that we've had that has been proven over and over again across the state and go here. Now, we can look at this, and if we say we may want to adjust it a little bit, that's fine. That'd be up for consideration. But we have a tool there. I'd say we ought to use it.
That's right.
But I'm not greedy, so that's all the Christmas wish stuff that I have this year, and subject to your questions.
Well, that was wonderful. You've been here less amount of time than anybody in the room, and probably were more helpful than me. And you and I have talked a little bit about this before. And one of the things I had committed to do with AGC, Senator Dugan, Representative Earhart, some of the ones that I know just have a tremendous amount of knowledge about all of this is talk to you about our recommendations or suggestions and try to tighten them up. But that's a good point on the construction manual. And I've said this a number of times, that I believe Georgia State Finance Investment Commission does a really thorough job. And that is in part, or in whole, because of following those guidelines that are set out in that construction manual. One of the things I would ask you, because of your experience in delivering these projects under construction management, you mentioned some things you'd like to change, or just kind of a wish list. Would you be willing to share with this committee maybe some of the things or examples of how that construction management delivery method has worked against you? Because I've heard that from, and I've said that a few times, it's not fair because of some of the things they're doing under this delivery method, that you're out there trying to do what's right, trying to get in there and compete for these jobs. And because you hadn't done 10 within so many miles or whatever of these, are there some examples that you'd be willing to share with the committee that?
Oh, everybody's going to have an example or two of those. And a lot of it's going to be, I don't know if it's a real example or a perception of how you see the world. We know that if you could have 5 criteria that are part of the selection criteria, and one of those criteria is fee, it's a hard bid. Because they're going to put everybody else at about the same level of experience, whatever the criteria there are.
Right.
And they're going to come down to fee. And if the fee is open during the selection criteria, they're going to go with the low fee every time. Low fee does not necessarily mean the lowest cost, though, on that, because you can, again, if we go back to the state construction manual, you're kind of defined on where you put cost, where they can be shown, where they can be collected. If you have Jim Smith from Terrell County that's now putting this thing together, a contract together, or the selection criteria together, and he doesn't know where it can be shown, where it can be collected, then some of those costs get transferred to other parts of the contract. So the fee is, that comparing fees is not always the same in that type of contract. And honestly, within the state system, if you haven't done this many state projects, then you're at a disadvantage. As a taxpayer, part of me is comfortable with that because with how many projects they've done, then they know which ones are going to be the most efficient, most effective. As a construction guy, I think it's abhorrent, and I want it changed right now. But you know, it's just one of those things where it depends on which side of the fence you're sitting on. But we got a lot of great companies in the state that have been doing all different forms of construction for a good while, and greater access to all is, and that goes back to what I was talking about, right sizing. I think that opens that up a little bit more.
Do you think, and again, from the construction perspective, not from the senator and the taxpayer's perspective, but from your background in construction, do you think it would be possible for us to come up with a sort of a template or a guideline on these RFQs? You know, I don't want to say regardless, but I mean, whether it's the technical college system, the regents, you know, because I know sometimes the regents handles their own projects, and then sometimes they'll use GISFIC or whatever. Would it be possible, do you think there would be a way to come up with a guideline on these RFQs that would
A best practice thing?
best practice
I think it would be.
guideline?
To say which delivery method should be?
No, they choose the delivery method of CM at risk, but when they issue out that very first RFQ, they're all over the map.
Right.
I mean, and again, we're not talking about
Yeah.
GISFIC, but I mean, particularly in our school systems or in some of these that handle their own, there might be,
Yeah. How many thousand projects have y'all done since CM at risk has been out there? Is that appropriate? Can
Yeah.
the people
Oh,
in
yeah.
the panel turn around and ask somebody in the audience? a question?
absolutely, absolutely. He works for the people
Probably done 200, 250?
this year.
No.
Overall? I'd be willing to bet you've done more than that.
CM?
Okay, regardless, 250. You threw me off. I can't remember where I was going with that
Yeah.
now.
Me too.
But anyway, there's where I was going is they have experience. They've got more experience than any individual school system would have. And I'm talking about now back to the Department of Education. Any individual school system across the state could possibly have. They have more knowledge. They've seen more stuff come up. They obviously have more experience sitting in the office on how to administer this thing after it gets going. You know, I'm saying this as a stereotype. You don't have the retired PE teacher that's now in the administrative office that has no knowledge of construction that's overseeing the implementation of the contract for his school system.
Right, and you had many of those serve on school boards.
Yeah. So you're apples to oranges a little bit on
That's
how
right.
it's conveyed. But if you have one set standard, at least when you're doing an external look, you can more clearly define where everything's going right and where it needs to be tweaked a little bit.
Right. Well, I appreciate that, and I certainly don't mean to just keep you up there. But one of the questions that I had gotten, and I think you could probably answer this best for us, is I know one of the things they do on these construction management delivery methods is that the owner pays the overhead. Where they have some of them where their fee is a little bit separate from where the owner would cover the overhead of travel, the
Yeah.
document. Is that
That should be clearly defined on the front end.
Okay,
You have
okay.
you have a spot that the GC is responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
You have the spot that the owner is responsible for.
Okay.
What you also often have is, because I'm going to touch back on something you said a little while ago, which I'm going to double check. I don't think you're right though, because you have a couple of contingencies often inside a CM at risk contract as well. You'd have the GC's contingency and the owner's contingency. Neither one of them can be used without the consent of. It's got to go through. I'm going to get way down in the weeds here. You got an OAC, owner, architect, contractor meetings, and if there's a change or you need to add something to it, this is not above and beyond the cost of the contract. This is within the cost of the contract, because we are obligated as a construction person the amount that we agreed to, the guaranteed max price, is the contract amount. I can't exceed that. So when I'm doing a renovation, like you were talking about a little while ago, and I have unforeseen conditions that show up that were not in any specific scope of work and the cost of that scope of work, that's where I have my contingency in there to cover that. If it exceeds that, that's the at-risk part. I'm in trouble because I am bound by contract to this amount.
But an owner initiated,
Comes out of their contingency.
right, and there's the potential that they could use that up, but the owner can, with the architect and the CM, say, hey, you know, we're just gonna have to eat this.
Yeah,
And
they
it can run over in that regard, but as far as the contractor or the architect, they can't initiate or I guess they can initiate an overrun in budget, but the owner can.
Yes, they could.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah, when I
I've
use
never-
that,
in
when
10
I
years,
use
I haven't
that
seen that done.
example with that school system, I don't believe that was an architect or a contractor initiated type of a big overrun.
Yeah.
I think it was some things that school system had just absolutely did not plan for, and then
Yeah.
ended up.
Okay, you asked me to stay up here for one more question, so I'm gonna answer it here. When you're going through the front end of the project, when you're going through the CM piece of it, you're sitting down with the owners and the architect, and you're going through, the owner's going, I'm gonna even go back a step further. The architect designs Taj Mahal. The owner falls in love with it. And then the money comes in, how much is this thing gonna cost me? And so you gotta go back in and say, Mr. Owner, as we sit here and work together, you're about $2 million over budget. Now, how do you want to do this? We can start going through together and looking at what is a wish list and what is a must-have. So you get down in there. Flash forward. You're 3/4 of the way through the project, and a lot of the sometimes time is money. You know, you're ahead of schedule. The weather's cooperated. The cost of certain goods, because they fluctuate during the span of a project, depending on how long they are, they come down, and you look at it and say, Mr. Owner, we've got this much of our contingency or your contingency left. We can go back and remember this list that we had of things that you wanted on the front side that we said we don't think that's going to be in the budget right now, because some of these projects are 2 years long or more. Mm-hmm. And they go, yeah. I said, do you want any of those back in? Because you've got we're past all the things where we thought we were going to need the contingency. You have this much money left back in. The last thing you want to do is to have a customer have a budget amount and hand them a check back at the end and not give them all the stuff they wanted in the project to start with. But you got to time it right when you're going along to make sure that you're not tearing stuff back out to add stuff that they wanted in there to start with. Right. So you've just got a little bit in there to cover both sides, but not exceed the guaranteed max price of the CM at Risk project. I got way technical on that one.
No. Hey, listen, I'm hearing you. I've talked about this for so many years with so many people. It made perfectly good sense to me. And just another quick, listening to you go through that list of the timing and the owner and the architect and all that made me think about a question that I had asked Mr. Woodward. How do you decide, and I'm going to come back to you with this question. I said, how do you decide to go what delivery method to use, design, bid, build, or construction management at risk? And a couple of the things that he said was that if there's a real tight timeline, we might use construction management at risk, or if the budget is really tight, we may float it out there, design, bid, build, to see where that comes in. And then the other one was, did I already say complicated? But he floated a couple of things out there that helps him determine which might be best.
Yeah, complicated.
Back to Senator, put your Senator Dugan hat on, taking into account your experience in construction. Do you think it would be feasible for us to maybe come up with some process by which it helps to determine which delivery method is best. Because I would say that there have been some that they attempted hard bid and it was not a good fit. And then they got in trouble in that hard bid. And I've admitted that to Mark and others, that I think they have tried to hard bid some projects that, quite frankly, would have been much better off going the design bid build. Now, if you're doing basic standard construction, and I use again the examples of 2 elementary schools that are being built in our county, one's already completed, one's in the process. The only thing that would change from that $4.7 million elementary school is if we had been in a bigger community, they would have needed more classrooms, they would have needed a larger lunchroom, a media center, etc. You would think that you could put in some guidelines that would help either school systems or the state or others be able to determine with a checklist, so to speak. You think that would be possible to come up with a...
I understand your question, and I think the intent is good. I think we'd, no offense, I don't know if this is the right language, I think we'd more likely screw it up by trying to do clear delineations. You're putting an engineer on something that's not straight engineer. If it's a school, are we talking about a school that's a certain square footage? And if you do, okay, well, we'll check that block. It's a square footage. But if you're doing that same square footage on an existing campus during the school year, can you see where I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There's too many variables in there that there's no possible way that you can account for all of them, or the list would be so long that they wouldn't read it. I would rather give them, I would rather provide a list of suggestions and let each individual one determine on their own.
Yeah,
If
I
that
like
makes
the
sense.
language that's in the Department of Education in that statute about, new funding projects or whatever. But
Yeah,
I've just wondered though if there.
I don't like that concept of that 5-year nebulous plan. And I know your position. In my opinion, that's illegal.
Right.
If it's a defined project and everybody knows what that defined project is on the front side and they are bid as a package, I'm still not comfortable with that, but it's legal. I just think I think it's lazy.
Right. Well, the reason I asked the question about coming up with some guidance as to how you select the delivery method is because, again, Mr. Woodward was pretty quick to be able to tell me how he decides it. But that may not be a fit for every project in every community for every different
Right.
agency. And so I get it. And I was just wondering if there would be a way to come up with some general guidelines, because when you have what I call basic standard type construction, like these 2 small elementary schools, those are $4 million jobs. These guys will do that with their eyes closed. I mean, again, I'm not saying it's simple. I'm just saying for what you do and the complexities of it, it's pretty basic. And I just wondered if that might be a way to at least have some conversation about. Now, if you have one that's built up here in Blue Ridge and it's built on site work is just crazy and the elevations are all.
Right.
And so it was just a thought.
Yeah, if you had and that's what I'm saying.
Too many variables.
If you had a single-story school building,
Right.
there's a basic rectangular on a greenfield site, with that one's not that complicated. That to me, that's a hard. Plus an available work pool with all the contractors and subcontractors needed in the area. That's pretty easy. But you
Right.
can't write something that says this and have it applied to every place across the state.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. I think it would get
Oh, yeah.
too many.
And that's why I asked. I was just kind of thinking out loud. But thank you
Thank you.
again so
Appreciate
much for
y'all.
your help. Who else did I want to try to? Mr. James, I'm sorry. I switched off of you there, and I apologize. But go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, these are just some general comments. The first, I'd like to thank you and the committee for allowing me to participate in this effort. First time to participate in a legislative committee. It's been very interesting and educational, so I thank you for that. Also, on behalf of the University System of Georgia, I want to thank you and the legislators for all your tremendous financial support for our capital program. I can tell you from my experience in working in other states, that's not typical, and we really appreciate the financial support we get from the legislature and the government, and we do our best to try to get you the best value for your dollars. Also, I want to mention about GFIC. I was disappointed Marvin didn't credit all the great planning we do with making these projects come in on budget, but I'm just kidding. We work really well with GFIC. They do a great job, and they make it look easy. You know, a lot of projects don't come in. Large construction jobs don't always come in on budget or on schedule, and they make it look easy, and it's not. And so we're really pleased with what they do on our large capital projects, and we work very closely with them. Senator Dugan mentioned the state construction manual. That's about a document that's about 4 inches thick. It's the result of a collaborative effort between construction professionals, architects, our representatives, GFIC, a very large committee of people that have developed that over the years, and it addresses all aspects of this, what we've been talking about, selection of architects, contractors, delivery methods, standard contracts and agreements, and so on. So I would encourage the committee to keep that in mind, that we already do have a fairly substantial tool in the state construction manual that we use. And certainly it can be improved, and actually probably needs to be revised some now to catch up with some latest things that have changed. But the overall, I think if you think about it, construction is one of the few things that we buy that are unique in our world. You know, most things we buy are built in factories and standardized. Every building project is unique. I've yet to see a simple project. I'm looking for one, but haven't seen one yet. And they all have their own subtleties. And so I encourage the committee to consider keeping the tools in the toolbox, is one term that's been used, and using one of the tools that we already have, which is the state construction manual. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Thank you, and turn over here again to Mr. Schofield. I apologize. Your name just slipped my mind earlier, and I have trouble with that anyway, but I'd love to kind of transitioning from our stakeholders that have participated from out there to the committee now, and would love to hear some thoughts from you.
Am I on? Thank you, sir. Once again, I appreciate the opportunity to serve as well on in place of Superintendent Woods. I would like to say, reiterate what Mr. James just said. We appreciate the participation from the legislature in our projects as well, statewide. We have a robust program in this state. As we meet with other states, we see how fortunate we are in the state of Georgia to have that funding available to our local districts. We are a local controlled state in the K-12 market. I think we've got to consider that. We also have understand the importance of developing some guidelines, maybe above and beyond what we have. This has brought out some of those situations that exist out there. Maybe we were aware of some of this going on, but not to the extent that's been brought out through this study. I think it's important. It's brought up a lot of conversation of our office. How do we prevent this from? What do we need to do? And I think providing some proper guidance through the RFP process is important. I think some of the opportunities that have been Mark brought forth earlier, some of his suggestions through the local markets are important. And I think we would support many of those efforts as we go forward. It has just been and we've spoke with many of our constituents across the state. They want to make sure they've got those tools in the toolbox that they have available. And it is important when you have 180 districts across the state of many different sizes. You have from a Gwinnett that serves 175,000 students each day, and 1,000 buildings across that district, to a very small district in South Georgia that may, or even in Middle Georgia, that may only have 200 students with one building. And all of those students have needs and have the we have the need to provide them with opportunities through their school facilities. And I think it's important for us to do that and to keep that in mind. But at the local level, the sophistication of the delivery methods and the availabilities of construction that's out there is so different from we know the individuals in Coffee County that you represent. They're not, they just don't have, they may need some extra assistance from us, maybe some standardization of the RFQ process. I'm not saying they've done anything incorrect, but if there was some standardization, it may be helpful for those size districts. So we would certainly be in favor of that. I think that's all I have. If I stutter through that. No, that's just where we sit statewide. We just have, but I do want to say this. I don't, we mentioned earlier, whispering, we have local control, and we want local control until we don't want the local control. I think that control is important in the K-12 market, but we can provide further guidance.
Well, and I think y'all can see by Mr. James and Mr. Scofield's comments, the reason they are on this committee is because with the regents working with Georgia State Finance and with the Department of Education, most of this money, most of these projects are probably in that direction. Would you agree with that, Mr. Woodward? I mean, through our regents and our colleges and that's a tremendous amount of money invested into those. And so I appreciate y'all serving. And what we will do now is kind of move to our members. I know you weren't quite here yet when I first mentioned Representative Gordon, but he's been a part of this committee and glad he could be with us today. And I was telling him how busy everybody is, and it's hard to make it to all these meetings when we have them. But I'll start down to my right and kind of work our way down the table. But and I know you've been following this, even though you weren't able to be at a couple of the meetings or whatever. Do you have any? And we'll have more dialogue about it when we go down the table. But do you have any immediate or priority type recommendations you would be willing to make, or some suggestions? What number are you, Representative? All right, go ahead.
Well, first off, Mr. Chairman, I want to just thank you for your leadership in this regard. I was, I guess, approached the committee from a standpoint of naivety to a certain degree, because I'm sorry, I'm not speaking close enough. I just had no idea it was all these pieces to the puzzle regarding these issues at hand, and nor did I know that it was somewhat of a disagreement from the construction management side to the design build side, and so being able to hear, not necessarily both sides of the argument, because I think that there are certain roads, no pun intended, that actually make sense depending on the job per se. But it's been very interesting just to hear the perspectives on why should or perhaps works in some situations, and why different parts of the industry feel there's some parts that are unfair in others. And so from a suggestion standpoint, I don't know that I'm there, but I definitely want to thank everybody who has contributed, not just on the committee side, but out amongst our audience, and that has contributed from personal and professional experience. So again, thank you, and I apologize for missing the first two. It's just been kind of crazy with family and work, but I'm glad that I was able to make these last two, because I have learned a lot. I think it's going to not just help me when we go back in session, but anytime something like this comes up locally, I can actually feel like I'm speaking from some standpoint of intelligence and not feel like the ball's going over my head.
That's right. I appreciate that. Yeah, Representative Gordon and I were sweet mates when I first got elected and moved up here, and then I must have made somebody mad. They moved me into a mechanical closet down on another floor. But I've appreciated his friendship and help. But Representative Donahue, we kind of pose the question back to you as obviously not just a member of the legislature, but this study committee. What are some things that maybe a list or just some priority things as we're running through recommendations, and we'll have a little bit more dialogue about it. What are some things that you see that just really stand out as some things that this committee might be able to look at to suggest or recommend and look into a little bit deeper?
You know, again, thank you for the opportunity to serve here. I appreciate the testimony. I'm a businessman. I understand business. I understand you have to make decisions that are proper or you will not be in business. However, you've made the statement several times that this is the government that is putting forward what they would perceive and want done, but it's our money. And with that, we need to make the proper decisions. Again, I've heard the word toolbox. I've heard let's don't take tools out. As men, we always want the newest tool, and we'd be lying if we didn't. That's why I said on the Christmas list, give me what you want. And I think we've come back to workshops, better interviews, educate, and access was the two words I guess I would hear a bunch. I have learned a good bit. CM at risk, I see the good there, but I see the good and hard bit. I see the good in each one, and as long as we use the rule book with those tools and we figure that we can come up with the access and to educate to where if we have down in a smaller rural city, this construction company might be big enough to do a job that they're not allowed to do, and it might make and help them grow. One of the things I noticed is there was a comment that let's go in with one construction company that's been there and to take under their wing another construction company to help them with the process. Do you think that's going to happen often? I would like to see that happen. I owned a logistics company for 30-something years. I trained a ton of people in the industry that are very successful now. Did it take bread out of my pocket? A little bit, but that was fine. I was willing to work with them and train them and started doing consulting after I left the business. And with that, my goal is one thing, to make you the best you can be with the proper tools in that toolbox. And again, it comes back to access. It comes back to educate. And it comes back to the better interview process. I have people that will submit a resume that comes before me, and they're not the greatest at sitting and doing an interview. You know what? If you polish up some of the skills there, they could probably do a better job on the next one. Then I've seen people that come in that wasn't good in a interview or a resume that actually was the best workers because I went out on a limb and hired them. But no, I think that's it. Transparency, we've heard that quite a bit. In government, the senator can disagree or agree with me, but we have a tendency to take something that's working and mess that problem or make it a problem and mess it up when we need to not have that PE teacher that now has been moved up that's making decisions that he or she has nothing or no idea of what they're doing. Again, I've learned a lot here. I've seen the process of building from a lot of places in the state. One of the things on the educational side is I'll tell people if I have 22 schools in my county and we take all the high schools and we come in and build a $5 million theater, now we just set the goal up. Everybody has to build a $6 million and a $7 million and an $8 million theater. And you can walk in and see that school system and look at another school system and another school system, and you know who built them all. I still don't have a problem if they're doing an expert job and it's efficient. However, we need to not push the other guys out the door and become lazy to where we allow just one group to do all the work, or we'll never have anybody but a Walmart. And, I think this is something in consideration. We need to just look at a few things to make the toolbox a little better.
Amen. Thank you. All right, Representative Buddy Harden, I see this paper's got a lot of highlights on it there. I'm anxious to see what he's got to share.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't know that I'm going to say a whole lot. I told you in the beginning, this is a new industry to me. but it's been very interesting. I do have a project in one of my smaller counties that's ongoing that, or it may be almost finished. I think we've heard from the contractors working on that, and it is construction management at risk. Done a great job. The county's been very satisfied. So I know that this is a process that we need to have. I think there are some things that we want to look at in our recommendations, and one is to be sure that all contractors who have access to those jobs that are construction management at risk. And if I think we heard this morning with maybe a little education and and some work, we can assure that everybody has an opportunity to bid those jobs, regardless of whether they've had past experience in those jobs, if they can show that they have studied the process and can bid a job effectively. So other than that, I don't have, a lot of suggestions. I do think when we get together and discuss it, I'd like to hear where other people are coming from, but I think we have found that construction management at risk is a good method. Design, bid, build can be used at times, and I think we just need to make sure that all of those contractors who desire to participate in any particular part have the opportunity to do so.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Representative Werkheiser.
No, I'll reserve my comments from when we get started on things. The only thing, I guess, if we're going to summarize what we're trying to study, and I appreciate all the work you've done outside the committee, is that it sounds like the CM has become the preferred. The only thing that has bothered me a little bit is that because of all the advantages of the CM, it seems like that seems to be the first choice that we're going to. It would have been nice to do what you said, come up with a criteria and say, well, if it meets all these, let's choose one or the other. But as the senator said, that's going to be problematic. But I just hope we can come up with some stuff that will, because ultimately, I think our ultimate job here is to save taxpayers money, and I think that we do need to just some way to kind of cautiously. It just seems like over the period of time that pendulum has swung pretty quick and pretty far if you look at the percentages, and I understand the reasoning behind that, but I just hope we can look at maybe seeing that, because if we just keep going down the path we're going now, that you can see where the pendulum's going to end up. So.
Well, thank you, Representative Werkheiser. I was just talking to Sarah just a minute, and what we will probably do, we've run through some very quickly, or what I think we will do, and I was just kind of getting some clarification on that. And I'd like to ask Mr. Woodward and Mr. Woodall and Senator Dugan, anyone, some of these suggestions that you've mentioned, recommendations, one of the ones I really liked is that you open subcontract bids in front of the owner. Now, I don't know how we tweak that. I don't know what it is. I don't know how that may be in the construction manual. I don't know. But I think I like all the best practices stuff, the construction manual idea. We've heard so many, and Sarah has been typing her little fingers away, and I've, believe it or not, I do make notes and have been listening carefully to this, but I kind of want to echo what some of the others have said. I was only hearing, and I've said this to Mark, I had gotten myself into a position where I was only hearing the bad about construction management, and I was somehow singled out as maybe that person or someone that could fix, but I've heard wonderful testimonies of how that delivery method is a great way to deliver these projects. And so I don't want you to think that even though some of the questions I have asked in this committee have been just, hard and to the point, maybe too blunt at times. But we're going to take the suggestions or recommendations from everyone, and I'd like for you to email them to us, to Sarah in the House Budget and Research Office, because this is your opportunity. I mean, particularly for those of us that are legislators and work in the construction business, I think what we have uncovered, or what I have personally uncovered, is that a lot of the things that were going on in construction management, delivery method was most unfair to the other construction management firms in a lot of ways. And so it wasn't just that the general contractors were feeling a little bit left out. So if you don't mind, and Mike, I'll say the same to you and Mr. Schofield, Mr. James, the ones that are with our Regents Board, our Department of Education, Mark and your group, Association of General Contractors, Senator Dugan, Mr. Woodward. I mean, literally everyone has an opportunity to send into us that Christmas wish list that Representative Donahue asked for. And then the members of this committee, the legislative members of this committee, will do the same. And as we move forward, we're going to try to prioritize those suggestions or recommendations. Some of them are just going to be easy. I mean, we've heard everybody is in agreement, I think, like I said, about you shouldn't be automatically disqualified because, and right-sizing jobs makes a lot of sense. I forget who said it, but when you have a company that does $100 million a year, doing that $2 million or that $4 million school, trying to right-size those, and I just don't know how you word that in legislation, except maybe through the construction manual or something. What's that?
I think that could help you with that language.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, I don't want to end it prematurely, because Mr. Buddy's going to be worried if we close this thing out an hour early. He's going to think I have lost my mind. But I really do want to make sure that since this is the 5th and final study committee meeting, that there's nothing you can say or a recommendation you can make that will not at least be read and reviewed, considered, and we look forward to trying to make this process better. I think a lot of the concerns were, and no offense, but I think a lot of the concerns were coming more out of the Department of Education. I know that even our colleges and our regents, the Georgia State, they seem to try to do a thorough job at moving through these delivery methods. But if you got anything that I need to cover that maybe I've missed, you got anything?
No.
You sure?
Well, the only thing I was going to say is recommendations. I don't know what your time frame is on that, like when you want.
Right. Today's Tuesday. I'd like to have those in this week. We've got to have this report signed and submitted by no later than the end of December. And we will email out that report to these committee members for your changes or approval or disapproval or whatever. And then I think she read in that resolution that I'm the only one that has to sign, and I want to make sure we're doing it right, Mr. Buddy. So thank you all again. I can't tell you how much. And again, Mark, and particularly Mark and Mr. Woodward, man, they've been so patient with me, trying to educate me. He's like herding cats and trying to keep me under control. But thank y'all so much, and we're gonna adjourn. Thank you. Anything from me? I do have something I need you to help me with later, though, not right now. I'll email you. Yeah, I'll text you.
Okay,
Got you,
okay.
got you